Welcome to day 8 of our daily Bible reading. So glad that you could join us today. We are going to be looking at Genesis chapters 20 to 22 and Luke chapter 8. If you look in the description below, you can see some links to Bible Gateway where you can read these passages. You can also get a schedule for the entire year of readings. So as we look at Genesis, we are continuing with the story of Abraham and Sarah. And once again, we have a situation where Abraham tries to pretend that Sarah is his sister as a way to protect himself as they are under the protection of another or under the governance of a different king. In this case, it is King Abimelech. And again, God is protecting Sarah, and he ends up protecting this king as well, because God does not like this technique of protection that Abraham has been using. But I think it is once again interesting that we have a situation where Sarah, as the wife, does not have a lot of agency. She doesn't have a lot of choice in the matter. But God is still stepping in and protecting her. After this repeat of this my wife is my sister story, finally Abraham and Sarah celebrate the birth of their son Isaac. Now, it was a number of chapters ago when some strangers came visiting, and they turned out to be angel messengers from God, and they said that Abraham was going to be the father of nations, and he pointed out that there would be a child that would come from Sarah, even though they were at an advanced age. Now we finally get to the point where Isaac is born. And one of the things that really stands out to me as I read this is that God has a timeline for God's plan, and it has nothing to do with our timeline. Sometimes God's timeline seems entirely impossible, such as Sarah having a baby at this point in her life. But God has a plan, God has a timeline, and God does things in God's own time. And we need to be patient, and we need to be faithful as we wait for God to do what God's going to do. Now, even after the birth of Isaac, Sarah is still bullying Hagar and Hagar's son Ishmael. Eventually, they get sent away, and God continues to care for Hagar and her family in the wilderness. And eventually, they are the beginnings of a whole new family of people, and people of Arabic descent in the Muslim world see Hagar and Ishmael as the beginning of their tribe, their lineage, their family. And so there are some additional stories about Hagar and Ishmael in the Muslim tradition, and they take a little different approach to part of this. So if you are interested in Hagar and Ishmael, I certainly recommend that you look up some of the material in the Islamic faith that has more information on them. Which brings us then to the sacrifice of Isaac, another one of these really, really tough and difficult stories that is very hard to read and understand in our current culture. So as I was reading this time, we have Abraham going with wood up the mountain with Isaac, and Isaac's like, where's the sheep? Where's the animal that we're going to be sacrificing? And Abraham just kind of, is non-committal on this. And they're going up the hill to do this sacrifice. And in the end, Abraham ties up Isaac and puts him on top of the wood and has the knife ready and is ready to sacrifice his son that he had waited so long to have, the son that is going to help bring about the many nations that would be part of Abraham's lineage. So there's a couple questions here, aside from the obvious of how can Abraham do this to his son. But, Isaac is not a small child at this point. He's climbing up this mountain, he's carrying the wood, and he allows himself to be tied up and placed on the wood, which is a question in and of itself. So some of the interpretations of this story look at this, that this is a test of faithfulness by God for Abraham. And the test is based on the strength of Abraham's love. How much does Abraham love his son Isaac? And is he willing to be obedient to God even to the point of sacrificing the son that he loves so deeply. So basically, the interpretation here is that if Abraham does not love his son, then there really is no test. There is no sacrifice if Abraham isn't willing to give up something that is meaningful to him. Now, a further interpretation here is, was Isaac also part of the test? Was God also seeing if Isaac was faithful and obedient to God and God's plan? Now, all of this is somewhat difficult to answer completely. We don't have enough in the text to really understand everything that's going on. In the Jewish tradition, there's a number of writings and interpretations that have been discussed and debated around this. And if you're interested in that, I certainly encourage you to read more about it. But I think the main point here is that when God is calling us to do something, God wants us to follow through. And often what God is asking us to do comes with a price, comes with a sacrifice. As Jesus would say, take up your cross and follow me. It costs us something to be in relationship with God, and we don't always get to do things our way. And so I think that is part of what we can learn from Abraham and Isaac's story. As we turn to the New Testament in Luke chapter 8, we see that Jesus is going on some journeys. He is walking and he is teaching, and he's got 12 male followers who are the primary people who are going with him. Although chapter 8 indicates that there are also women that are following. It is not just the 12 men who are the people that we mostly focus on as the 12 apostles, the 12 disciples. The women, unlike the men in this passage, are actually listed by name, which to me indicates that these are important people, that they are named in this section. I also think it's important that it specifies that the women helped with their own goods. So not only is Jesus collecting this group of people around him that he's teaching, that he's healing, that he's preparing for his time of ministry. They have to eat, they have to be clothed. There are expenses to ministry back then, just like there are today. And these women donated money, donated food. They had resources that they brought to the ministry and helped support the ministry. I think a lot of the times we have this impression that for the most part, women are unnamed and unimportant in the biblical record. But here, not only are the women named, they are specified as bringing resources, physical goods to support the ministry. And I think this is important for us to continue to lift up the involvement of women in Christian ministry, just as women in Jesus' time were supporting the work of Jesus Christ. We have a parable here from Jesus, the seed sower. And this is one where Jesus is describing how the farmer is throwing the seed out, and sometimes it's on rocky ground, sometimes it is on weedy ground, sometimes it manages to hit some good soil, and there's different things that happen to the seeds. Some of them quickly sprout, but there's not enough water or there's not enough depth for the roots. And so the plants just flame out pretty quickly. Or maybe they are crowded out by the weeds and they might sprout, but then they can never grow because they don't get enough water or they don't get enough sunshine. The seeds that are on the soil have water, they have good soil with lots of nutrients, they grow strong roots, and they grow strong plants. Now, part of this story, though, is this question of who understands the story. Because Jesus tells a bunch of stories, and frequently people are like, Jesus, could you just be a little more clear? We really don't understand what you're trying to tell us. And here someone actually asks, who understands this? And Jesus is like, well, those who are ready to hear will get the point of this story. So one of the questions that I think we need to grapple with when we read this today is, are we ready to hear? Are we showing up? Are we taking time? Are we listening? Are we trying to put the pieces together? Are we trying to figure out what Jesus is saying to us? Or is it kind of going in one ear and out the other, as we say these days? Another problem we often have is that we only hear what we want to hear. The passages that we're comfortable with, we pay attention to. The passages that maybe we don't feel so comfortable with or are more difficult to understand, we kind of, jump over those. Are we willing to be challenged by what Jesus is saying and Jesus's stories and parables? Which then, when we're looking at this parable, leads us to the question, how deep is our faith? Are the roots of the seeds that Jesus is implanting in us finding fertile soil where it can grow down and we can build a strong faith that is going to make a difference in the world, a faith that helps us build God's kingdom? Now, along about now, some of Jesus' family members show up again. And if you remember a couple chapters ago, Jesus started his ministry by reading during the Sabbath worship time in the synagogue back at home. And his village members rejected him. His family declined to be a part of his ministry. They pretty much ran him out of town, trying to kill him along the way. Now, in this passage, some family members show up. So there is still a connection between Jesus and his family. And as we know later on in the Gospels and in the book of Acts, both his mother Mary and some of his brothers, such as James, become vital parts of the ministry that eventually becomes the Christian church. But at this point, when Jesus is told, hey, some of your family showed up, Jesus doesn't really say, hey, great, I gotta go, guys, family reunion time. He says, all who hear and listen are his family. So he's presenting a bigger idea of what family is. It's not just blood, but it's the people who hear, who listen, who put their faith into action, who are part of the story and the ministry that Jesus is starting to grow at this time. The next story talks about this guy on the other side of the Sea of Galilee in a Greek area. He had a whole bunch of evil spirits in him, and he is healed. And after his healing, he wants to go with Jesus. Now, we've been reading about all sorts of people following Jesus around. So it's like, what's one more joining the merry band of Jesus followers? But Jesus is like, no, I want you to stay. Now, this is a little bit difficult to understand on one hand because he's got a whole bunch of other people following him around. But he says, stay and tell others. Now, later in the gospel, Jesus and the disciples show up in this area again, and there's a whole bunch of believers. So this one guy who's healed and believes becomes one of the early church planters, one of the early missionaries or preachers. And he is bringing the message of Jesus to people who are not Jewish. Once again, we're reminded that God has a plan for all sorts of people, not just the people of the Jewish faith, not just the people of the Christian church today. God is connecting with new people in new places and using them in new ways. And in this case, God uses this Greek guy who had been plagued by evil spirits and uses him to bring the message of Jesus' love and grace and forgiveness to a whole new group of people. Part of the lesson, I think, for us today is not just to be open to the fact that God is already present and working in other places in God's own way, but that the stories we have of our relationship with Jesus are powerful, and Jesus wants us to talk, to share our story with other people. The final story in this section has a bleeding woman who works her way through the crowd and touches Jesus' prayer shawl and is healed. And at the time, Jesus feels power go out from him, and so he stops. He's like, hey, who touched me? And his followers were like, what are you talking about? We're in a big crowd. How could you tell that anyone touched you? There's all sorts of jostling going on. But he knew. And I think the point of this story is not just that Jesus healed a woman who had been outcast because of her physical ailment, but this woman was exceedingly vulnerable. Because of her particular ailment, she was not allowed to be around Jewish men. Because she was bleeding, if she came into any sort of contact with Jewish men, they would be considered unclean and would have to go through a ritual purification process in order to be clean enough again or holy enough to be able to worship at the temple. And so men avoided her completely. she had to announce that she was unclean anytime she was in the presence of other people. So for her to sneak into this crowd and work her way up to Jesus without yelling at everyone, I'm unclean, make way for me, put her at grave danger for retribution from the community who wanted to stay away from her. Now, Jesus heals her, Jesus accepts her. Jesus does not berate her for not having announced that she was in the crowd and that she was unclean. Jesus says, your faith has healed you. This is a radical action on Jesus' part that goes against the Jewish rituals and traditions of the time and goes against the way that the community operated. So, once again, we are seeing here that Jesus stepped outside the normal realm of things in order to offer grace and forgiveness and healing to someone who had been set aside or shunned or bullied by the community. And I think today we have a number of people that, for a variety of reasons, our culture is trying to set aside as somehow different and should be treated differently and should not have the same rights as everyone else. Maybe it's immigrants and migrants. Maybe it's people who have a transgender identity. Whoever it is, we need to think carefully about how we set them apart and how we can bring them equally into our community and treat them with the same respect and dignity as Jesus showed to this vulnerable woman who had a severe medical ailment. Jesus' teachings are always challenging, but these are also teachings that bring healing to broken relationships and broken communities. And at the end of the day, these are the teachings that I think give us the wisdom that we need to build a better community that brings wholeness and healing to the people that we know. Hope you have a super day, and we'll see you next time.